Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true, scary stories to help you fall asleep. Today, we're going to be listening to our weekly compilation of true, scary stories. I hope you enjoy them. So without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true, scary stories. In the 1990s, a nurse in New Jersey killed hundreds of hospital patients. Sometimes he would sneak into patients' room at night and inject them with fatal medication doses. Other times, he would put the medication into IV bags in the supply room, so they would kill whatever random patient they were given to later. He was accused several times. Some patients pointed him out before they died. Some staff thought he was creepy and dangerous and refused to work with him. He kept getting fired from hospitals, but the hospital managers knew that if he got arrested, they would be sued by the families of the patients he murdered. So they just fired him and didn't call the police. That happened at 12 different hospitals over the course of 16 years. Investigators believe that he killed as many as 400 people. After he was arrested, he confessed to 40 murders. In 29 of them, he gave enough detail to be charged and plead guilty. He is linked to 300 plus more deaths than that, but details of those will probably never be known, because so much information was lost over time or destroyed by the hospitals. While I was on life support, there was this other girl on a ventilator just down the hall. Like me, she'd had all of the right symptoms: headaches upon waking, vomiting without nausea, and getting lost in the house where she'd lived for years. Like me, she researched them extensively. Unlike me, she reached the right conclusion and asked her parents for a scan. But they had a bunch of other kids and money was tight, and she was at the right age to see symptoms as unduly catastrophic. So they said no. Meanwhile, I was treating my symptoms with the gym. My mother had begged me to get a scan and I'd said no. Until I had health insurance of my own, I couldn't afford it, as it would show a pre-existing condition that would destroy my future insurability. The other patient took up 3 jobs to save the money for a scan. She made the rounds of several neurologists, begging. Each responded dismissively. She was too young and looked so well that she had to be hypochondriac. Finally, one took pity on her and gave her a scan, telling her outright that it was only so that she'd stop asking and that she'd hear results in some weeks. I kept going to the gym until the day that I collapsed, vomiting blood, bursting a pupil. She went in for her first craniotomy, walking, talking, fine. My parents and boyfriend would sit beside me through my coma, holding my hand, telling me how much they loved me. She'd have her own such trio doing the same. I'd awaken. I'd meet her parents, her boyfriend. I'd visit the ICU. I'd see them growing more gaunt, more desperate each time, until the trip when I learned that she'd gone into long-term coma care. I'd recover. She'd die. Brain cancer is that kind of a jerk. Since then, I've taken the survivor's guilt to do everything that I can with my life. But that so easily should have been her outcome instead. That's the outcome for so many. It's terrifying, because it demonstrates how we as a society often dismiss the health complaints of all but a narrow slice of the population, without even registering what we're doing. How many lives do we, unthinkingly, throw away. My father had his spine severely fractured in an assault when I was an infant. He had a real jerk of a doctor that was super dismissive of him. One day he was at an appointment and she left the room, at which point he took a peek at his chart. She'd recorded him as a hypochondriac. She'd never examined him. He was so furious that when she came back, he ripped his button up open, turned around, and demanded to know if that looked like hypochondria. For the record, a 0 of his spine was rotated almost 90 degrees by the assault, and it was very visible. It's a miracle that he regained the ability to walk at all. Mom says that the doctor went pale and ran out of the room, never to be seen by them again. The sheer arrogance of some doctors infuriates me beyond words. At work, we had a patient who was referred for a spinal scan just so he'd shut up. His general practitioner was trying to wean him off of his pain meds, but the patient was fighting this tooth and nail. It was clear from the referral that the doc thought that he was a drug seeker and wanted to shut him down. The first radiologist looks at the scan, sees nothing wrong, but his spidey senses are tingling, so he dumped the case in my lap and refused to do it because he's terrified that he's going to get sued. I'm not a doctor, I'm an administrator. I spend an entire week basically medically stalking the patient and digging up previous scans from the most obscure locations so that the doctors are satisfied. And then I give it to our best doctor. All that work ended up being unnecessary because the better doctor spotted what the lesser doctor's instincts only hinted at. His spine was riddled with cancer. Bone cancer is one of the most agonizing cancers you can get, and this guy had it all up his back. My just under 2-year-old fell down in the kitchen. He had just started talking, and 5 minutes before he fell, he said, "I hurt," and fell over. We thought he was being silly, but he said it 2 to 4 more times. Finally, my wife took him to the kitchen to have a popsicle. It was like 8 a.m., but whatever. She stood him up and he literally fell over. Then he tried to talk again, but it was just baby talk, gibberish. We rushed into the pediatrician. As we were waiting, I noticed that one side of his face was dropping. I said, "Looks like a stroke." The pediatrician who showed up at some point said no way, highly unlikely for a 1-year-old. They ran tests for what felt like days, but was probably more like 10 minutes. I kept saying his left arm is dropping now, and his face is fully stroked out. Finally, my wife stood up with him in her arms and yells, "Screw this. I'm driving him to the children's hospital." The pediatrician kept telling us to go to a different hospital because he had admitting permission or whatever. They also tried to get us to take an ambulance, but said it would take about 15 minutes. We ran out, buckled him into his seat, and drove like a race car driver to the children's. They took him in, and there was immediately like 40 doctors in the room. They ran all kinds of tests in seconds. Guess what? Stroke. He was having a hemorrhagic stroke from a burst capillary in his brainstem. He was dying, like for real. If we had stayed at the pediatrician's, he would have died. It was terrifying. Those ER doctors at Children's Hospital saved his life. They were brilliant. I barely remember the day, but at some point the doctors at the Children's asked questions like, "Was he struck? Did you hit him?" etc. We realized later that they were attempting to discern if we caused it by hitting him in the head. The burst capillary was actually so deep, a hit on the head wouldn't have caused it, per his neurologist. We spent nearly 3 months inpatient. including a harrowing week in the NICU. He worked really hard at walking, mostly thanks to the musicians who got to the hospital to play for the kids. Every time they were there, he wanted to dance, and he did a ton of work every week just to be able to dance when they played live music. Fast forward, he is 8 and healthy as an ox. He has drop foot and a very weak left hand, but he is so good. Many of the outcomes that were possible were much, much, much worse than his slightly weak left hand and slight drop foot. The neurologist told us one time that they were fairly confident that he was going to be left-handed because of where the stroke happened. Apparently, if he had been right-handed, his speech could have been affected much worse. Anyway, that was terrifying. We had a 2-month-old baby with us as well. We spent years traveling to and from the children's hospital for therapy and appointments. We just had his last appointment with the neurologist last week. They said, "We don't need to see you guys again," which is a good thing. It's not coming back, and his scans all look amazing. One of my friends had a job in the hospital looking after patients, making beds, etc. I heard he randomly quit his job, wouldn't talk to anyone about it. I bring some beers over to his house and try to see if I can get him talking. He's a total emotional wreck. Finally get him to talk, and he says that he was working one night in the hospital when he heard a nurse shouting for help because someone was going into cardiac arrest. So he runs down a hallway, and some man runs toward him. They almost bump into each other and the man shouts, "Where's the exit?" My friend points to the exit, then runs into the room with the man going into cardiac arrest, only to see that it's the exact same person who ran past him in the hallway. He died in front of his eyes.
In the mid-90s, my mom and I lived in Malaysia while my dad was in the UK, studying for his medical exams. I was a toddler, so I don't remember many details of our home, but photos tell me it was idyllic and backed onto a forest which proved a popular playground for the local kids. As it was just my mom and me, she often had to get my babysitter to look after me while she was working at the hospital. I recall rather liking my babysitter, and by all accounts, she was very fond of me. However, she was only a teenager at the time, so she also had other responsibilities. And at that point, I'd proved myself a bit of a scamp, as I was a woman about town, on my trike zooming around in the forest with the other kids. This is why my mom would sometimes ask the hospital creche to care for me, so she could pop in a few times a day. I believe this is where my mom met her friend. Mom's friend was a doctor at the same hospital. They had both emigrated from India at similar times, and they bonded over this experience. According to Mom, she seemed nice, if not a bit overzealous when venting about her ex. She took a shine to me as she had children back home of a similar age, so she'd often come over for a cup of tea chat and bounce me on her lap. A few months down the line, her demeanor started to change. The previously flippant but forgivable behavior began to deteriorate. She was beyond simply being tardy and eccentric. It was alarming. One afternoon, she came to chat with my mom over a cup of coffee, and everything seemed perfectly pleasant. After a while, she gazed at my mom with a beaming smile. She said she had something to show her, and that it meant a lot to her. It was deeply personal, but she felt like she could trust Mom, so she wanted to share it with her. She reached into her handbag and showed my mom a small box. When she opened the box, my mom couldn't quite understand what she was seeing, but then it dawned on her. It was a vertebra, a single human vertebra. The bone had belonged to her late mother, with whom she was very close. She went on to explain how her mother was the only person to have not betrayed her, and that she finds herself falling victim to despicable men. My mom could feel that she was becoming increasingly intense and agitated as the conversation progressed, and eventually it went south with her condemning her ex for abandoning her in a foreign country. She was spitting, her voice rash from screaming about him and how he deserves a slow death. It was at this point my mom decided that was enough and tried to calm her down and saying her goodbyes. Mom's friend didn't turn up for work the next day, or any day after that. According to the secretaries, she had just gone AWOL. It wasn't until a few years later that my mom had realized what happened. By 2001, we were back with my dad and settled in the UK. Mom often keeps in touch with the friends she made during her stints practicing medicine abroad. And on one such day 20 years ago, she received an email. One of the secretaries she had worked with in Malaysia sent an email containing a link to a newspaper article. It detailed the unfortunate news of a suspected suicide which had taken place locally. A woman fitting the description of Mom's friend had taken her own life from the top of a residential building. It had a picture that bore a striking resemblance, but it was the text that followed making her blood run cold. The article stated that the police in India had been on a manhunt for the woman who they suspect is the deceased. The reason being, she had flown to India 5 years before and lured her ex to a rendezvous. There, they believe she poisoned him before dismembering his body into small pieces over the course of 3 hours. The smallest parts were disposed of using a toilet, while the larger body parts were put into a suitcase. She spent the next few days hiring a taxi to visit remote locations, where she would dispose of various body parts. The alarm was only raised when the taxi driver, her final journey, detected the rancid smell of decay emanating from the suitcase. He tipped off the authorities and it resulted in her imprisonment. A few years into her incarceration, the woman jumped bail and fled. The police manhunt resumed, but the trail eventually went cold after it was suspected she fled back to Malaysia. With no further leads, the case went cold. That is, until 2001.
For one reason or another, the police have yet to make a conclusive identification on the body of the self-unaliving victim.
So, while there is every chance that she is the woman who fell, there is also a chance that she isn't. Info. This recollection is based on information provided by my mother and a newspaper article. I would be happy to provide proof if that is what is needed. Thanks for reading.
This happened in 1989. I had given birth to my son early in the morning the day before. I'd lost a fair bit of blood, but had been up walking at least once by then, so I wasn't too dopey. My son was sleeping in his bassinet next to my bed. A nurse that I hadn't seen before came into my room and grabbed a hold of one end of the bassinet and started to pull it away. I grabbed the other end and said, "What are you doing?" She said that she was taking him away for his blood tests. Now, I happen to be a registered nurse, and I knew what sorts of things were done to newborns, and he had already done his tests. I pointed to the band-aid on his heel and said, "He's already done his tests. So what sort of tests are you talking about?" And she muttered something about not being sure, but there was some test that he needed. I maintained my fast hold on his bassinet and told her to find out what test and then let me know. She went away and never came back. And honestly, I was so out of it that I never even thought to mention it to anyone. But the fact is, several babies had been taken that summer by imposters dressed in uniforms. So I will never know for sure, but I felt like we'd dodged a bullet. I'm a doctor in surgery, and one day I got a case of a man. No big deal. Some cut to sew. I won't give details, but he was around his 30s and had a wound, 4 stitches on his arm. When I start to clean the wound, strange and creepy compliments had already started. How I got a beautiful doctor. You have beautiful pupils. You are beautiful. You have a nice smell. I just ignored him until he grabbed me by the hips and pulled me to him. I watched him. What the heck? And asked him to take his hands off of me or I'd call security. He laughed and said why I'm dramatizing. I asked him to leave, or I was going to report him, and then he got up. And he said, "You know, girls like you shouldn't turn down such offers. Your time is gone. Beauty is transient." I was in shock all day. I told my colleagues about it, and the second time at the checkpoint, my dear colleague took it and warned him. I've never seen him since, and I hope I didn't. I don't speak English, so I wrote this story via Google Translate. So I apologize for any mistakes. I'm a doctor and a 32-year-old single man who spends most of his time in the hospital, and the rest is spent pumping iron. That had been pretty much my life till last year. But the pandemic has been kind of an equator-shifting event for us medical professionals. I've seen many of my close associates perish. My mentor, my best friend, that motherly canteen woman whose name I didn't know till her death, but who never failed to give my tired face her day-brightening smile. All these wonderful people just died too soon. After 2 months of corona duty, stress of seeing so many deaths and losing people I knew and worked with weighed me down. It began to get to my head. I began making mistakes in the sanitation protocols, which, even though small, could endanger me and my patient's safety. I told my senior and requested to be shifted to normal patients ward till I gained my complete composure. She said that the best she could do was shift me to ER, but I'll have to manage routine rounds as well. And I was fine with it. I knew that we were short on doctors. It was a Friday after completing my shift. I was just back to my apartment. I was tired and hungry, but then I was called again. Apparently there was some high-profile accident case. She was a girl of 24, only daughter of the local mayor. She had a fractured arm, a bad wound on the elbow which required 5 stitches. Shards of glass had pierced her shoulder deeply, barely missing the jugular vein. It took me hours to patch her up and head home. A week went by. I kept checking her progress, and she was coping well. She was very friendly, but nothing about it made me uncomfortable. I understood since COVID protocols didn't allow visitors to stay. She yearned for someone to talk to. But with each passing day, she grew bolder. Friendliness turned to flirting, which I tried to handle with my best professional smiling face and silence. Soon, her infatuation became a hot topic of canteen discussions and leg pulling, and I began avoiding canteen. It was a normal summer day and I was doing my rounds. I reached her room and, keeping my best stoic face, I began checking for vitals. She said that she was feeling pain in her shoulder. I knew the glass wounds were deep, but so far they had been healing just fine. After telling her that I was going to pull her gown down to have a look, I barely managed to touch it, and she pulled it all the way down to her belly in one tug. I froze. I kept my eyes on the wound. It appeared to be healing normally. I averted my eyes and told her so, but she insisted that I have a closer look. She touched me inappropriately, and I decided it was best to walk out. By the time I reached the door, she said something so vulgar and inappropriate that it made me cringe with disgust. I marched out without turning back. I thought it was best that I told someone before I was accused of something that I did not do. So I told about her advances to my fellow doctor who was of my age, and his words were appalling. In the coarsest way possible, he insinuated that if he was me, he would jump at the chance, and laughed it off that I was scared of a female. I decided that it was best to go back to COVID duty and stay clear of trouble, and I easily got that. I did not see her and heard she was discharged, I almost forgot about her in the rush of corona patients. A week later, she was admitted with mild COVID symptoms, and her father literally arm-twisted hospital management by holding supplies to provide her with private ward and special care. All of a sudden, she became the most important patient. People were dying in that hospital daily. People whose organs were failing them, whose oxygen saturation was making them struggle for each breath. And we were short to just 4 doctors. The rest were either infected or quarantined by now. And here, hospital's management was busy providing VIP treatment to an insolent brat. After 2 days, I had to go check on her. She had a fever. Personal protection equipment kit made it difficult for her to identify me. But as soon as I introduced myself, she had this bizarre smile on her face. She looked unstable with her messy hair, sweaty and sick look. As I reached her, she caught my PPE suit in her hand. Her nails were digging into the polymer, nearly tearing it apart. Shocked, I tried to pull it back, but she began rambling stuff amidst her crazy, uncensored yelling. I checked what I had to and pulled out of her hold and exited the room. Later that day, I talked to the management. They took it casually because they had bigger issues at hand like the pandemic. And what harm can a sick woman do to a buffed-up 6'3" guy? Hearing this, I decided that it was time that I left this place, at least for my own mental peace. I resigned and joined another hospital in a different state. More than half a year has passed by, and I still feel like a quitter. I feel frustrated. In all this fiasco, I was asked why I wouldn't want to be with this woman. Asked if I was gay. If I don't want to be intimate with some woman because I don't like her, or because of my professional ethics. It doesn't make me gay. Harassment affects men mentally too. It may not be on the scale that women face, but we're not steel. Men have feelings too. This story comes from a time in my life when I was in a really bad place. I had been misdiagnosed with BPD since I was a teenager, when I was actually bipolar. So, when my first full-on manic episode came along, no one in my family knew what was happening. They thought that I was on some sort of drug or something, because I went long enough without treatment that the mania developed into psychosis. I was really, really delusional and sick, like completely out of my mind. So a few of the details here are fuzzy, but I definitely have a very clear memory of this moment. Ever since I was a teenager, I had experienced psychogenic seizures. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's basically a pseudo-seizure caused by extreme distress or anxiety. It's basically how my body reacts in crisis mode, instead of the fight or flight instinct in really high-stakes situations. So my parents called an ambulance, since they had never seen me have so many consecutive episodes at a time. And the EMTs show up while my brain is pretty much on fire with mental illness. It was the most vulnerable I've ever been. A couple of EMTs put me in the ambulance, where 2 other EMTs were sitting in the back. One of them was really nice to me, and tried to do the best he could to soothe me. The other guy was this white, frat-looking dude, with a buzz cut, and he was just frowning, staring at me and not saying or doing anything. I guess he was more like glaring. Whatever. He was the last thing on my mind. We arrive at the hospital, and the nice guy and the frat guy push me into a holding room in the hospital, while one of the others went off into the hospital, I guess to figure out what to do with me. The frat guy finally speaks and says to the nice guy that he can go ahead, he can handle this. The nice guy looked unsure, but he seemed younger and more inexperienced than the fratty EMT, so he just nodded and left. The guy then turned his attention back to me, and I felt eyes shooting daggers at me. He gets up close and grabs my wrists, which caused a huge spike in anxiety, so I started convulsing again. He tightened his grip by a lot. Like, it left red marks, and I tried to tell the first person I saw after this event what he had done, but he insisted that I did it to myself. And who's gonna trust the crazy chick, right? But he held my arms down. Then he got all up in my face, and his voice got real low, but really firm and commanding. He said, "Listen, I know you're faking it. Everybody knows. You aren't doing your parents any favors by causing a scene, so just stop it. Stop it." I literally felt his spit on my face. I didn't know what to do, so I screamed, "You need to work on your bedside manner," as loud as I could. And shortly after, a nurse and my dad came in, and the guy backed up and speed walked out. I remember someone at the door trying to stop him, but he just kind of shouldered him off and stormed away like he was angry or something. I never saw him again after that. I had a few more freaky experiences at the hospital's psych ward, but that was the one that I remember most vividly. About a month ago, I started working in a nursing home near where I live. I gotta say, it's not a bad job if strong smells and putrid sights don't bother you. The residents here are usually sweet and lovable, although there is rude, grumpy people here as well. Who can really blame them though? They don't have many years left, and many of them don't get visitors anymore. It fulfills me to talk with them and give them someone to talk to since their families are no longer around. All was going well here with this job, until they put me in the dementia wing. I always knew that I'd have to work this wing. They bounce me around the floors, pretty much wherever they need me. At first, it was just another normal day. Put together my cart and clean the floor. However, after I came back from the first 15-minute break, I started getting very unsettled. I'm not sure what caused this trigger, but if I had to guess, it was because I was too tired to really take in how creepy this side of the facility is. The rooms are strewn about almost randomly, as if they were trying to pack in as many people in here as possible. The residents here are often gray and gloomy, missing hair and teeth. I walked along the crowded halls, cleaning room by room, really taking in these people's lives and trying to piece together some story. What unnerved me more was the rooms without a lot of possessions, as if someone simply said, "They're so far gone, why would they need a lot of stuff?" Broken clocks that no longer work, or were set to a very wrong time, as if to really pound into my head that most of these men and women have no concept of time anymore. The overhead lights that drone on, the rectangular boxes that house a remainder of the back rooms in a vague sense. This reminder was greatly heightened in the residents' bathrooms, where the buzzing was harsher, louder, and more vivid. I turned off I don't know how many lights in these bathrooms to ease myself a bit more. The walls were a pinkish tan color. This was the biggest reminder yet. For some reason, the color seemed to fit perfectly with the unsettling atmosphere. The staff was even creepy in a sense. The way they weren't put off by it, even seemed joyful, made me feel more out of place here. I wanted to go home this day. I'm not a weak-minded person by any means, but something about the atmosphere was making me incredibly uncomfortable, like I was a ghost walking through these halls. Now there's only about 10 to 15 rooms left. I pulled my cart into a big open alcove in the hallway where most of the residents were sitting in wheelchairs, as none of them had the strength to walk anymore, staring mindlessly at a TV playing cute videos of animals, assumingly to put the residents at ease. However, this one thing that made me feel comfort quickly turned to dread. It was off-putting. This was the one good aspect of the wing of the nursing home, as if it didn't belong on the television. Their eyes. They looked at me with such sorrow, as if to say help me without saying anything at all. I'm not really sure how many of them can actually speak. Some of them look at me and ask, "Where am I?" And I'm at a loss as what to do, because I don't know how to answer in a way that they'll understand. Then, the screaming, the cries for help, the yelling for anyone to come comfort them. yelling out blood-curdling screams when the nurses remotely touch them in any way. I just have to watch as I'm just a janitor who cleans their rooms. No, their homes. And I'm not allowed to touch the patients. No way to give comfort other than words, when they can barely hear, let alone process what I'm saying. This wing is so incredibly unnerving and sad. Listening and watching all of this does remind me of a piece of art known as Everywhere at the End of Time, and I feel as if this experience is only more unnerving, having prior knowledge to this sad piece of art. The worst part of it all is this could easily be any one of us when we get old, not knowing what is real and what isn't, and crying out for loved ones who aren't there and will never come. I'm an EMT basic for a private ambulance company in the Midwest. For this call, it was my turn to do paperwork and sit in the back with the patient. We were called to take this elderly woman from the hospital ER back to her nursing home after she had a medical issue earlier in the day. The time was around 7:40-ish, and we arrived to the ER room she was in, and she just lays there, facing straight up, not moving, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. We asked the RN if this is her typical mental status/behavior, and they say yes, and go on to explain that she suffers from advanced dementia and generalized muscle weakness. They say that she is unaware of anything happening around her, and that isn't directly physically affecting her, and she sometimes just mumbles to herself, never acknowledging anyone or anything in the room. One of the hospital techs had to go in and change/clean our patient up before transport, and she got a little agitated from it, but as the RN disclosed, she never acknowledged anyone's existence and just babbled on a bit more rapidly, which continued for the rest of the night in our care. We got her over to our stretcher, buckled her in, and once we were in the ambulance, we started transporting. Inside the ambulance, I kept it dark, since she was staring blankly up at the ambulance dome lights, not wanting to hurt her eyes. The only light that I had was the laptop with our EPCR, patient care report, and from the little EMT light next to the captain's chair for doing paperwork or small tasks. With these small lights on, I could see her face pretty well, as she just babbled on and on, talking about nonsensical things to people that did not exist, non-stop staring at the ceiling. Once I had finished with my final set of vitals en route and put it in the laptop, I shut the screen down and placed it on the shelf next to myself. I'm sitting in the captain's chair at the head of the stretcher, facing backwards towards the doors, and before I turn the EMT light off, I notice my patient staring directly into my eyes, not muttering a word. I moved my head to the right and left a little bit to see if she was just fixated in this direction, maybe from the noise of the laptop closing, but she followed my head's movements, never breaking eye contact. Intrigued but not really fazed by this, I turned off the EMT light. I can just barely see her eyes and face in the dark, and they are still entirely focused on my face. She then spoke directly to me, just one sentence. "The angels are calling for you," as she points at me with one hand, with no expression on her face other than a blank stare. She stares on for a couple of seconds more, before looking back up at the ceiling once more, and just mumbling random stuff again to things that aren't there. The rest of the transport and drop-off procedures went on with no other incidents. I know it was probably just another visual disturbance to her, but man, was it super creepy, and it will forever stick with me. I am and have been a paramedic for about 10 years. My entire career has been spent in emergency medicine, responding to 911 calls and providing advanced life support for life-threatening illness and injuries. The calls we respond to range from inappropriate use of an ambulance to minutes away from death, and oftentimes it's already too late. If you've read my other stories here, then you know the background. But in 2014, I moved to another city a couple of hours away from home to work. The city was smallish, less than 100,000 people, but the ambulance serviced the entire county where the city resides. At the time, there was a significant oil boom in the area, so thousands of people flooded the city and county to work in the oil fields nearby. This caused the city to get a little rougher, as you had people from all over the country moving there to work, and that many people in a small place increased the cost of living, and we saw a large increase in violent crimes as well as traumatic injuries. We worked 24-hour shifts, which weren't too bad. The days were usually somewhat busy, and at night the ambulance station had rooms with twin beds that allowed you to get some fairly decent sleep at night. Most of the calls that would classify as crazy, creepy, or scary always tend to come at night. The day that this story takes place was a little different than normal. Normally, I get an EMT basic partner, which means since I'm an advanced provider on the truck, I get all of the patients. But today, I had another paramedic partner because we were training in a new hire paramedic. It was her first day in field training orientation. This means that we generally let her take the calls and sit back and evaluate her performance to ensure that she is capable and doesn't kill anyone. This was her first job after graduation, so she was still pretty green. I could see that she was very nervous and trying very hard to do her best. So as per usual, the day was pretty busy, but as it began to wind down, I was getting ready to attempt to take a nap. I kick off my boots and lay down on the bed, on top of the covers. Easier to get up and going that way if a call comes in. I put my radio up to my head, full volume like always, so I can be sure to wake up if we get a call. Sure enough, midnight starts to roll around and I hear a call go out. Dispatch says, "Man who has been stabbed to death is not breathing." Luckily, it's not my call, and another ambulance responds. So I go back to bed, or at least try to. About 30 minutes later, another call goes out, and this time it is for me. Dispatch information: man with a knife wound on his hands. Police are on scene. I get my boots on, wake up the new girl and my partner, and walk out to the ambulance. The rest of the call was right smack dab in the middle of downtown. We responded non-emergent, as it was not a life-threatening injury. As we arrive on scene, there's probably 6 police cars on scene, all with their lights on. The area itself was through an alleyway and behind a building just off the main street. As we pull up, there are a number of officers, a couple of sheriff's deputies, and a detective all standing around this man with a rag on his hand. As I got closer, I could see that the man was bald, middle-aged, and had almost a homeless look to him. He also had a big dark spot in the middle of his forehead. One of the officers approached me to fill me in on what's going on before I talk to the guy and start to treat him. The officer tells me the man has a large laceration on the back of his hand that he received from a knife. At this point, I was still a bit groggy and didn't put 2 and 2 together. The officer says that the man said that he was attacked by another man and that he is probably going to need stitches. So, as it's not serious, I have my FTO approach first to begin her assessment and give me her treatment plan. I stay close behind her, and we both walk up to the man who is in handcuffs. As we approach, the dark spot on the guy's forehead is now clear. On the center of his forehead, stretching from his eyebrows, and what would have been his hairline, is the biggest swastika tattoo I've ever seen. My FTO begins to talk to the man as I stand back and observe. Something about the man's general composure and response chilled me. When we first walk up to the man, was muttering something under his breath. I couldn't tell what he was saying, but he was repeating it over and over. My FTO asked the police to uncuff him to see the cut on his hand more clearly. At this point, one of the other officers produced the knife he believed to be the weapon that caused the injury. The knife was in an evidence baggie, and it was covered in blood. It was nothing special. It just looked like a cheap plastic pocket knife, like you would buy at some cheesy gift shop. It was a folding knife with a black plastic handle and a blade that was maybe 3 inches long, with a bit of serration towards the handle. The man showed us his hand. On the back, cutting right through another large swastika tattoo, was a laceration that went from the base of his pinky finger to the lower fleshy part of his thumb. It was quite wide also, approximately 3 centimeters, exposing the bones of his metacarpals as well as his tendons. The bleeding had mostly stopped with pressure from the towel he was holding on to. When my partner asked the man what had happened, the man then repeated to us what he had been repeatedly muttering to himself. "I killed him, man. He's dead, man. I had to have killed him. He's gotta be dead." At this point, I'm starting to put it together and understanding the larger picture. We get the man into the ambulance so that we can assess for any other injuries that may not be visible under his clothing. After a thorough search, we realize that there are no other injuries, so we begin to transport him to the hospital. My FTO bandaged the man's hand, and as we were driving, I start to ask questions to try and figure out the details. The man told me everything I wanted to know, and never lost that chilling vibe, staring distantly as he recounted what happened. The man told me that he's homeless and was wandering around when a friend offered him a ride. He says that he was leery of the man, but decided to get in anyway and accept the offer. The man said the friend began asking him if he ate it inwards. The man said that he didn't and that he wasn't racist. He tells me that this is when his friend became upset with him and tried to stab him with a pocket knife. The man said that he attempted to defend himself, managed to wrestle the knife away from his friend, and stabbed him back before jumping out of the car and running. So with this shocking telling of the tale, we continue to transport the man in silence. Also, as a ride note, an officer rode in the ambulance with us the whole way. After we dropped the man off at the ER, we all kind of sat there shocked, leaving the hospital. We returned to the station and tried to get some sleep. However, we were not destined for sleep this night. An hour later, we get another call for a body removal from downtown, less than 3 blocks away from our last call. We pull up to the area, which is in the middle of the street. The street itself is blocked off 100 feet on both sides by a fire truck and police officers. The fire truck was equipped with a double stack of 4 halogen lights, risen up on the ladder, shining down to illuminate the area. Walking up with the stretcher and body bag, the detective on scene tells us that they're done with the investigation, and they are ready for us to take the body to the medical examiner's office. At this point, we're still about 50 feet away from where the body lay, from where I can see the person laying in the middle of the street. We get closer and take a few minutes to examine the body. What I see, and putting together what I was told, is astonishing to say the least. The man, another middle-aged man, appears white, possibly Mexican, lays in the middle of the street on his back, with his arms spread eagle and his legs straight. There is a vehicle parked on the side of the road, with its driver door still open. I figured that must be the guy's vehicle. It was parked neatly, not haphazardly or incorrectly. The deceased man has streaks of blood coming from his nose and mouth, with several small puncture wounds on his face and cheeks. Looking at his torso, there are about a dozen more knife-shaped puncture wounds in this chest and abdomen. Most of the wounds were so jagged and barbaric looking, you could see adipose tissue pushing out of them. There wasn't much of a blood puddle under the man, but a very large trail of blood ran from the man to the side of the street where the curb is. The blood then continues its flow another 10 feet along the curb before spilling into a storm drain. With that much blood, the man was exsanguinated and bled out there in the middle of the street. We packaged the man into the body bag and transported him to the ME's office. When we got back to the station, My charge medic told me the officer that rode with the first patient requested that we fill out a report on what we heard the man say. Thankfully, the rest of the shift was uneventful. Fast forward to a couple of years ago. I received a call from the state's attorney. He asked if I remembered the call, to which I informed him I do. He told me that this person is going to trial for murder, is pleading not guilty, and he would like to go over my statement with me as I would be a key witness and require my testimony in court. We went over my statement and then we talked about it a bit. Then he told me he would be in touch and wished me a good day. A few days later, he calls me up again and informs me that the man changed his plea to self-defense and that I was needed in court in a week. Literally, one day before the trial, he calls me up again. He tells me this time the man changed his plea to guilty and that I was no longer needed. I don't know what happened after that. I never really looked into it. It's just another brick in the wall, so to speak. A story filed away in my brain, probably never to be forgotten. Thanks for reading, and I hope you enjoyed. This happened a few years ago. I did some work experience at a funeral home, and on one of the mornings, myself and another member of our team had to go to a mental health facility. The building was very old looking when we arrived through its gates, and when we went inside, it seemed massive. It sounded like our voices were an echo. We were there to pick up an item from someone recently deceased, and were taken to a room to wait for the person in charge. It was pretty silent for a while, but then a woman appeared at the office door, opened it, came inside quickly, and then smashed the door closed again as quickly as possible. She suddenly turned to us and explained that a patient had become violent and was running around outside in the corridors. This alone was scary enough for me, but then within seconds the patient came to the door and looked through the window. She banged on the door, screaming something that I couldn't understand. A male nurse then appeared and took her away to her room as quickly as she had appeared. We then sorted out what we came for with the woman in charge, and then proceeded to get up to leave. We started to walk down the corridor towards the exit, but I started to hear a noise in one of the open rooms. I looked inside, and it was dark apart from a man watching TV on his own. The light from the TV was the only way that I was able to make out the outline of the man. He started mumbling something really quietly, but then suddenly out of nowhere became really loud and started shouting. He was shouting something along the lines of, "Help me now," just over and over again. I was terrified and could not get to the exit quickly enough. I never had to go back there again, and I'm glad that I didn't. At the beginning of August, I overdosed on my sedatives. I was rushed to the hospital and stayed in the psychiatric section for 2 weeks until I was moved to another psych ward. There were many units, each had its own building, and mine was next to alcoholics, drug addicts, and some people who were there because of violating the law. Since I was in an open section of my unit, I was allowed to walk around the hospital area. Then, like after a week of being there, I started going to the cafeteria area to buy cigarettes and cocoa. Ever since then, one of the dudes from the alcoholics section started to hit on me, basically saying some nasty stuff, asking how old I was, etc. It was bearable at times because my roommate always called him out. But then, when I was there already for some time, he started making really creepy comments. Firstly, he asked if I was taken, to which I replied that I am. And then it started, making comments about how I broke his heart, then how he cannot stop thinking about me. Once I was discharged, I was so relieved that I wouldn't ever meet him again. But I also sometimes visited my friends there, and when he noticed me waiting near the cafeteria, he always came up to me trying to touch me, asking where I live, that he'll find out where I live and that he's going to mess with me, how I broke his heart because I'm taken, and how I'm not only breaking his heart, which is bleeding, but also breaking his spirit because he can't stop thinking about me, and how every single night he once again thinks about me. One time he even tried to kiss me. This all happened in one of the many times that I visited my friends. I don't know if it could be considered stalking or just a creepy, disgusting behavior, but because of him, I stopped visiting my friends and have been even more scared to go anywhere by myself. According to my dad, when my grandpa died, he and my mom decided that I was too young to attend the viewing or the funeral. I was 2. My aunt and uncle decided the same for my 3-year-old cousin. A few hours after returning from the funeral, my dad walked into the living room to find me talking to an empty chair. I told him I was talking to Pappy and asked how he couldn't see him sitting there, and I then proceeded to describe the exact outfit that he was buried in, down to the tie pattern and pin on his lapel, despite never seeing him in this outfit. Freaked out, my dad called my aunt and explained the incident. She told him that my cousin had just done the exact same thing an hour earlier. I have a couple of stories, but this one always gets me. When I was around 7, my grandmother took care of a baby whose mother was an alcoholic and drug addict. This woman would bring her child, let's call him John, to my grandmother's house and leave him there for months at a time. Needless to say, our family became very attached and thought of him as part of the family. His mother came to get him one night, and her drunk boyfriend flips the car. John was in a coma for about 3 or 4 days. One night, my older brother wakes up everyone in the house, screaming and crying, saying that John is dead. Once my parents get him calmed down, he tells them that John came into his room crying, saying that he has to leave but he's scared and wants my brother to come with him. While my parents are trying to convince my brother that it was just a dream, the phone rings and it's my uncle calling from the hospital to inform us that John had died. This happened over 30 years ago, but I still get goosebumps just thinking about it. Sort of the same thing happened to my grandmother. She was washing dishes in the kitchen in an empty house because my grandfather had taken all of their kids to the beach for the afternoon. Suddenly, she hears the voice of her favorite brother across the country shout her name, and she's so surprised that she jumps and twists her ankle. She looks around but can't find him anywhere. My grandfather came home to find her sitting on the couch, icing her swollen ankle, and she tells him what happened. 2 hours later, they get a phone call from my brother's wife, saying that he died at the moment she heard his voice. My grandmother was in a care facility suffering from dementia. I used to visit her quite frequently, but after she stopped recognizing me, I stopped going. One morning I was getting ready for work, and this overwhelming and completely random feeling of love from my grandmother just hit me completely out of the blue. 20 minutes later, the phone rings, and it's my dad informing me that my grandmother had just passed away. I still don't really believe in any of this life after death stuff, but what happened did happen. Something kind of like that happened to me too. My aunt was an alcoholic, had 2 younger boys, and was in and out of jail. After suffering most of her adult life with depression and a whole other basket of mental and emotional issues, she finally remarried and was seemingly happier. One night while I was at work, I was closing the theater and all of a sudden got really depressed, and I started crying for no reason. I couldn't explain it. That night, I went back to my apartment and cried myself to sleep. I woke up to my dad knocking on my front door. Very strange. He told me that my aunt had unalived herself. The night before she died, she asked her husband if he would hold her one last time and cried herself to sleep. He had no idea of most of her issues and didn't think anything of it. He felt terrible afterwards. Okay, so this reminded me of a story. I was at sea on a container ship. I was miserable. Things had been going very badly with the crew. I was missing my family, and I was regretting my career for taking me away from home for so long. I had broken up with my girlfriend because I knew she was going to cheat on me, etc. It's a long story. Anyway, I'm laying in my bed one morning half asleep, and I had this dream where I saw my grandfather, who had been dead a few years at his summer place. He was walking with big strides, and he looked radiantly happy. He didn't have the limp that he got when he broke his leg at age 70. He was smiling at me, and he gave me the feeling that he was proud of me and that I should keep at it. And I was sitting on a beach chair next to his wife, my grandmother, who had been in a nursing home when I left. It was the most vivid image of him, and we'd been so close when he was alive. The dream meant a lot to me and really changed my outlook. I even got up to write down my thoughts. When I got home, my dad picked me up on the dock, and he handed me the program from my grandmother's funeral. She died at right around the same moment that I'd had the dream. She and my grandfather were together again, and that's why he was so happy. A similar thing happened to my dad. My grandma, his mother, was in a nursing home with declining health. He was working in his office at home and suddenly felt a wave of complete love and joy wash over him for no reason. After this episode, he gets a call saying Grandma has died. He called me soon after to tell me that Grandma had passed and what he felt before he got the call. My dad is a bit of a spiritual man, but puts rationality before anything. So hearing him say this makes me believe him. We all like to think that Grandma's happy somewhere with Grandpa, who died a few years before, and she wanted us to know that. I'm not entirely sure what happens to us when we die either, but I like to think that if there is something, it's a wonderful feeling as my dad felt. Perhaps your grandmother was telling you the same thing. I have a similar story. My mom and dad have the same dream when something bad is about to happen. It's not exactly the same right down to every detail, but the general story of the dream is the same. It's only happened 3 times in the 20 years that they've been together, but here's one of the stories. My mom and dad both dreamed that I was going to be hurt/killed in some way. I was only 3 at the time. Well, in my mom's dream, her mother, who was deceased at the time, came to her saying that she just wanted to hold me. I've never met my grandma. She was killed by a drunk driver before I was born. Well, she proceeded to tell my mother that she just wanted to meet me and told her don't be mad. In my dad's dream, he just felt like he lost something very important, and it ruined his life. He was helpless. Well, they both woke up and freaked the heck out. but proceeded to go about their day as usual. My dad went to the grocery store, came back, and parked his truck. He had an F-250 at the time. My older sister, who was 5 at the time, was strapped in the front seat of the truck and couldn't get out, so she was screaming and crying, just throwing a fit. My dad went and took the groceries in the house. I went outside to the truck. I tried to get in it, and I fell beneath the tire. I, being 3 in all, also threw a fit and just stayed there crying. My sister proceeded to throw a tantrum and ended up kicking the thing into neutral somehow, and the truck rolled over my head and stopped on my chest. My dad came out, saw me, freaked out, couldn't find the keys, they were in a grocery bag, and screamed and yelled for any neighbors to help. They tried to lift it off of me, but it was too heavy, so they had to push it over the rest of my body. I had to be flown to the hospital. In the helicopter, my heart stopped for about a minute. The only damage done was scarring and a broken collarbone. Plus my teeth were crushed, and I had to get all caps when I was little, and had braces for like 6 years. That was the first dream that my parents had like that. The others were when my little sister and brother were born. My little sister's lungs collapsed, and my brother was very sick. My mom had another dream years later with her mom, explaining that she'd held us all now, and everything is going to be okay. Nothing really terrible has happened since. My grandmother's entire life, she had a recurring nightmare. In this nightmare, she would be walking down a long dark hallway, turn to the left, open a door, and see something terrible. She'd always wake up before seeing what it was. In her 40s, she, her husband, my dad, and my aunt were on vacation. They booked the hotel at the last minute, so they ended up having to get 2 rooms with 2 twin beds on opposite sides of the floor. My dad wakes up at around 3 a.m. and can automatically tell that something's not right. He calls out in the darkness, "Dad?" No response. He turns on the bedside light. "Dad," he says a little louder this time. Still no response. Getting worried, he slides out of bed and shakes his father. He doesn't wake up. My dad ran down the hotel hallway to my grandma's room and started banging on the door. My grandma worriedly opens the door, and my dad shouts, "Something's wrong with Dad." He leads her down the hallway, a long hallway to the last door on the left. My grandmother reaches the door, turns to the left, and sees her husband dead in bed. He had a heart attack, and she never had that dream again. I've had a recurring nightmare since I was about 7. Friends and I are in the woods and boonies. I don't know why. We stumble across a house with an older lady chilling on the porch. She's friendly and tells us she's in the middle of cleaning out her basement. It's a cavern under her house filled with riches and oddities. She says we're welcome to check it out, so we do. It turns out her small cavern is a pyrite, fool's gold. So it is dazzlingly impressive, but ultimately worthless. Disappointed to learn of her mistake, our host offers us lemonade before we continue on our way. As we ascend the cellar stairs to collect our refreshments, the distant horizon is aflame with distant mushroom clouds. We all just stop and stare, wide-eyed. That's when I wake up. At least if this is the same deal, I know that I won't die immediately in the impending nuclear holocaust. I have something similar happen to me, though. Probably not so creepy. I don't have déjà vu the way most people seem to describe it. I have dreams about pretty mundane things that years later actually happen. The most interesting one happened when I was 14. I was at my grandmother's when I woke up, but in my dream, I was in a hospital bed being pushed down a hall, through double doors and into a hospital room. There, waiting in the room, was a pretty red-headed woman that was relieved to see me. I always knew it was going to happen, but wasn't sure when. 15 years later, I'm diagnosed with stage 3 cancer. I've had several surgeries, one that goes wrong and accidentally cripples me, and I'm in the hospital because I have serious blood clots. I refuse all pain meds because they make me feel worse than I do. So I have a clear head when I'm being rolled back from an exam of my legs, when it feels like I'm 14 all over again, and I don't know what's going on. The woman in the room was my wife, and she said that I had the most confused look on my face, that I didn't know where I was and that I didn't recognize her. I told her that she had met my 14-year-old self, and that for 15 years I had been waiting for that moment to happen. After 9 months of chemo, she cheats on me and leaves me. It broke my heart so badly that I wish the cancer would have just unalived me. However, later I'm with my new girlfriend having breakfast, and suddenly, a very confused 22-year-old me steps in, and I feel like everything is going to be all right from then on. She's now my fiancée. The whole deja vu thing has really changed my outlook on life, and my perception of what time really is. This reminds me of a story that was posted on Ask Reddit a couple of months back. A guy, he deleted his account shortly after, told in detail 2 dreams that he had when he was a kid that he was 100% sure was events that are just yet to happen. One of them had already happened exactly as he had dreamed it, with names and everything correct on people that he had never met. And the one friend he told it all to was there with him and was freaked out as he was. The other one is yet to happen and took place in New York, with some street vendor selling pizzas at a corner. He was upset, and the last guy in the bunch he was there, forced to pay for everyone because he had done something earlier that day. It was a funny story and all, so I started to PM him under another account. I'm more paranoid than a parrot. I switch accounts basically each month. And eventually we had a chance to meet up and take a few brewskis. Before that day, I thought he was kidding, making a story on Reddit and all, even though several other people chimed in and said they had similar experiences. I just took it as a bit of fun. But he was so weird. There are no words for it. He retold the story, and it was obvious that he believed it. But it was the way that he reacted to things. He laughed just a bit too early. He swung around and looked at noises that were about to happen. A glass shattered, and sometimes continued conversations without waiting for my answer. Usually short yes or no answers. Either he was the greatest performer out there and should be paid to do that to other people or something, or something was seriously off with him. I don't want to put any credit to having any sort of ability, but I just don't know. Sort of the same thing happened to my grandmother. She was washing dishes in the kitchen in an empty house because my grandfather had taken all of their kids to the beach for the afternoon. Suddenly, she hears the voice of her favorite brother across the country shout her name, and she's so surprised that she jumps and twists her ankle. She looks around but can't find him anywhere. My grandfather came home to find her sitting on the couch, icing her swollen ankle, and she tells him what happened. 2 hours later, they get a phone call from her brother's wife, saying that he died at the moment that she heard his voice. I lived away from home after high school in California. At the time, I didn't have a car, but I rode my bike everywhere. My grandfather had passed away a month earlier, but sometimes I felt like he was around. So I was on my bike, booking it down a sidewalk one day going the opposite direction of traffic. I was getting to an intersection and had the green arrow, when a minivan rolled up in the right turn lane and stopped. She turned her head and saw me, looked me right in the eye, so I figured she was waiting. I didn't slow down. Just as I'm a few feet from the curb going at least 20 miles per hour, she guns it. I'm talking holy crap, light flashing before my eyes. And my friend, who was on his bike about 50 feet behind me, later said that he thought the exact same thing. There was no way that I was going to avoid a nasty accident. I hit both brakes. Rookie mistake. Because now my wheels are locked and my front tire skids off the curb into the busy street. As it hits, it stops. But the bike is still moving, pitching me forward. I'm literally flying through the air. Time has slowed down, and I can see where I'm about to land, in the path of the lady's tires. Suddenly, I felt two hands, one on each shoulder blade, shoving me down. I didn't fall like an arc like you would expect. I was literally slammed into the pavement, knocking the wind out of me. I glance up to see the rear tire of this minivan roll within 1 inch of my fingers on my right hand, maybe a foot from my head. My arm was in an L shape. The car behind the minivan stops. These ladies jump out and check on me. One of the women said, "How did you do that? You were going too fast. I thought for sure that you were dead." I don't remember what I told her. But again, my friend said the exact same thing. 1 second, I was supermaning it towards the minivan. The next, I had just stopped, like I'd hit a wall and dropped prematurely. I can't prove it, obviously, but I'm still pretty sure that my grandpa had intervened. A coworker of mine told me that she was saved from a car accident by her grandmother. Driving along, about to cross an intersection, and something pushes her foot down on the brakes suddenly. The car fills with light, and she has a strong impression of her grandmother's presence. The next moment, a truck speeds across through the intersection out of nowhere. If she hadn't stopped as suddenly as she had, she would have been in a serious accident. One week, during my freshman year of college, I started getting really anxious about something really bad happening to some of my friends. I have statuses from this week that stated, if anyone ever hurt one of my friends, nothing would stop me from unaliving them, and other obnoxious posts like that. I kept my friends on a close leash. Let me preface this by saying that I kept my horse at my school's stables, and would go up there every night to clean his stall by myself. It was never a big deal. On a Wednesday night, I was up there cleaning my horse's stall around 7 p.m. I started having a panic attack and was in tears because I became so utterly terrified that I would be R-worded, and ended up sending a text to one of my friends about it. I ended up not finishing cleaning my horse's stall, and once I could get my legs to move, I ran as fast as I could to my car so that I could drive back to my dorm. The panic attack didn't go away once I got to my dorm. I posted a ridiculous amount of statuses about how anxious I was and how I couldn't sleep because I was so utterly anxious. My last status posted was around 6:30 in the morning, right before the panic attack stopped. Fast forward to that Friday. My friend from high school, who was going to school in another state, messaged me and told me that she wouldn't be returning to school for the next semester. This took place in December. When I asked her why, she told me after a series of messages that she had been essentially kidnapped and assaulted that previous Wednesday. Her whole ordeal started right around 7 to 7:30. and she was finally released/got away around 6:30 the next morning. I almost vomited. I have always been extremely empathetic, to the point where it scares me. I usually have small premonitions, thinking about songs minutes before they come on the radio, suddenly remembering a person from school/work that you haven't seen or talked to for years, and then running into them within hours. The one big one that I had was a little creepy and happened years back. I would often go to a family friend's house after school on a Wednesday to clean her house for a bit of pocket money. She would leave a back door unlocked for me. It was a pretty good neighborhood, heaps of military families. I would generally open up all the doors and windows to air the house as I cleaned, but for some reason I felt uneasy. I'm always one to trust my gut feelings, so I locked the door behind me and didn't bother with the windows. Anyway, I start cleaning, and then half an hour later I hear these banging sounds coming from the back door. It scared the freak out of me. I creep up the hallway and peek around the corner at the door, and there was this dude peering into the house through the small glass window next to the door. He had the most startled face when he saw me. He turned tail and ran pretty quick, and I called the police and then the house owner. I later found out that it was her ex-partner coming to talk to her, even though she had a restraining order against him. I never went over again. I was thinking about this thread and remembered another one that I had that was not a dream. I was working as a bank teller, and it was a regularly busy day. I looked up and saw this man walk in, and I knew that he was a robber. I made a mental note of his appearance and clothes because I knew I would have to describe him to the police. I hurried with my last customer because I wanted him to come to my window, because none of the other tellers knew that he was a robber. I called him over, and he handed me a note demanding money. I pressed the silent alarm, said the code word, and ducked under my desk, just as I had been trained to do if faced with a note passer. He left empty-handed, and I was able to give a complete description to the police. He did get caught eventually, and I testified to the grand jury to help put him away. I was 13. It was the last day of the school year and the last day at my school. Me and my best friend were walking home together as we normally did, but we were walking really slowly because we were going to different schools in September, so we wanted to make the most of it. We made it to his house, and we said goodbye. He was going to his dad's house the next day for a week, but we were going to meet up whenever he got back. He went inside his house, and I just had this really strong feeling that I should go back and hug him. It was weird because we didn't really hug. I stopped walking, turned around and started walking back to his house, but then decided that I was just being crazy, and I'd see him in a week anyway. I just had this really horrible feeling that something bad was going to happen. The next day I was watching the local news, and they said that there had been a car accident. I felt sick. It happened in the area that he'd have to travel through to get to his dad's house, but I just wrote it off as a coincidence. The next day I was watching the news again, and they said that there had been a fatal car accident. Him, his dad, and his brother had all died. That was 12 years ago, and not hugging him has got to be one of my biggest regrets. I drive a friend home back in high school. It was raining really hard, just unbelievably rough. When we arrived at his house, I got out to grab one of his gym bags from the car, while he grabbed his iPod from the aux cord. There was this strange moment where it felt like everything just stopped. We looked at each other over the hood of the car, and a shiver went down my spine. He just frowned and said something awful has happened. That was my feeling too. He went inside and I drove the rest of the way home. 2 hours later, he sent me a police report, freaking out. 2 girls from a neighboring high school that we knew through other friends had taken a turn too sharply and spun out because of the rain. Both of them perished on impact. There had been a car behind them, so the time of death was a known fact. My friend glanced at the time in my car when he grabbed his iPod, and the weird moment outside was the time that they died. Still gives me chills to this day. Okay, so about 10 years ago, I was asked to be in my friend from high school's wedding. I was living in New York City at the time, so I took the train down to my parents' place in Virginia. The next morning, we were going to drive to the state the engagement party was in. That morning, I woke up and didn't want to leave my parents' place. We finally got on the road at around 1 p.m., way later than expected because I was dilly-dallying. The entire ride, I was saying that I felt weird. We didn't get to the hotel until around 1 a.m. My mom went to go check it in and get our key at the front of the hotel. She comes back to the car, and we drive around the area of the hotel that our room was supposed to be in. This was a very nice hotel in a very nice area of town. We get our stuff and walk into the elevators. Then a man comes out of nowhere and starts saying that he loves some store near the hotel. It was weird, but whatever. The elevator opens, and my mom and I walk in, and so does this strange man. We hit our floor, but the man doesn't hit any floor. That's when I noticed that he was holding a gun. I paused. Then I finally said, is that a gun? And the guy says, no, it's a keychain, that my cousins gave it to me. I noticed this man had gotten on the elevator at the wrong side. We were the ones closest to the floor buttons and emergency stop buttons. The elevator stopped, and we ran out of there and into our room. Then we called down at the front, and as we were trying to explain what just happened, 2 gunshots were fired, and a car goes tearing out of the hotel. The police were called. A woman and a man were shot. And guess who their cousin was? That man in the elevator. We were so exhausted the next day, we just went back up to Virginia. My friend understood. It was so random. My mother and aunt used to live in Florida together, and my aunt used to work at a seafood place by a beach. There was some sort of event going on at the beach, with tents set up everywhere. A band was playing in one of the tents later on that afternoon, and my mother and aunt had planned to go once my aunt got off of her shift at work. It started to get kind of windy, and my mother was hungry, so she decided to go bother my aunt and get some food. Trudging up from the beach, she sat down and ate. Then my aunt got off of her shift and immediately wanted to go down to the beach. My mom, however, got a really bad feeling all of a sudden and asked her to wait for a while. My aunt wasn't having it because my mother tends to be a worrier anyway, and started complaining that they were going to miss the band, but my mom feigned a stomachache and guilted her into staying. Not a few minutes later, they saw people booking it up from the beach past the windows of the diner. A water spout had popped up and made brief landfall, managing to take down the tent that my aunt and mom would have been in had they gone down to watch the band. When I was younger, I was just a kid, I had went to my town's county fair. I happened to run into a girl that I had known from a church that I used to go to. I hadn't seen her since swapping churches, and it was nice to see a friend. We decided to ride the Ferris wheel together, one of the ones that have cabins that are covered on the top, but open on the sides. Each of the cabins would hold 4 people in them. As we were standing in line for the ride, I suddenly felt sick. Not the kind where you're going to puke, but where something just isn't right. It was like a weight pressing down on my chest, and it was like something was trying to tell me not to ride the Ferris wheel. I told my friend that I had decided that I would rather walk through the funhouse with my last ticket, and that I hoped she had a good time. So that's what I did. About 30 or so minutes later, my family and I left. When we got home, we saw in the news that 3 girls had fallen out of the top cabin of the Ferris wheel. My heart dropped. I couldn't help but think of my friend. When the news finally said who the girls were, my suspicion was sadly confirmed. My friend was one of the girls who fell out of it. Then I remembered something. There were 3 of them in it, when the cabins hold 4. So if I had stayed and gotten on it with my friend, I would have been the 4th one to fall out of it that day. All of the girls ended up being okay in the long run, with the exception that one of them was in critical condition for a while, and I think that she ended up with some mild brain damage. Many people in my life know this story, but what they don't know is that I've always felt bad for not telling my friends about what I felt, and possibly stopping her from experiencing that. My husband, daughter, and I were renting a great condo, and everything was going well. Great school, on a lake, 5-minute commute from our jobs, 3 blocks from our daughter's school, and her daycare was a block away. Everything was great. In about late July, I started feeling really uneasy about our condo, like it wasn't safe, which was weird. We never had any trouble, and the landlord was amazing, and the super was great. I tried painting and making the place look better. No matter what I did, something was feeling really wrong, like dangerous wrong. In a matter of a few weeks, the anxiety grew to not just me, but my daughter and my husband as well. Our daughter, now 10, started sleeping in our bed as well as all of our pets. It's like the little voice in my head was screaming to run as far and as fast as you can. But we had been really happy there for almost 6 years at this point, and we were trying to save up to buy a house. Luckily, we were able to move out and bought a house and closed on September 28th. I'm a very type A person, and I'm the first one to get unpacked and settled into a new place and make it home. But this time I didn't have to push to get things unpacked. I blamed the Thanksgiving and Halloween, the move, my friend's wedding, work, etc. On November 30th of 2018, at 8:29, Anchorage, Alaska, was hit with a 7.1 magnitude earthquake, which was immediately followed by several huge aftershocks of 6.5 plus. My husband has just sent my daughter off to school, and she was about 50 yards from the house. My husband ran out of the house to get her. The pets were going crazy. The only major damage was my daughter's huge and heaved dresser fell over, and we broke some glass. Because I had not yet unpacked, the only real casualty was half of a nice bottle of rum we got as a housewarming gift. A few months later, I run into my old landlord at the grocery store, and we got to talking. She told me that we were really lucky we moved out when we did. Apparently, right after we had moved out, the new neighbor in the building next door snapped and horribly unalived another neighbor's pets and started shooting, and a bullet went through the fence and into my daughter's old bedroom. When the earthquake happened, the lady in the neighboring condo in our old building was not home, and during the earthquake, the cooking oils fell on the stovetop, which turned on the burners and ignited her kitchen, which in turn set our old kitchen on fire. Now, at the time, At 8:29, my family would still be getting ready for school because we lived 3 minutes from the school by bike. This happened, our daughter would have been in the upstairs bathroom getting ready for school, and my husband in the shower downstairs. The landlord said that the upstairs bathroom cabinet came off the wall and shattered glass everywhere and decimated the toilet, which then started flowing into the downstairs bathroom from the ceiling. Meanwhile, all the tile on the downstairs bathroom apparently fell off the walls. The sliding glass shower door basically exploded, and that bathroom mirror broke as well, filling the entire bathroom with broken glass, tile, and running water, as well as the brick fireplace collapsed, filling the house with brick dust and chimney soot. Apparently, bricks fell off the roof area and into the yard, smashing the fence, where my daughter kept her bicycle for school. So not only would my daughter have gotten potentially hit by a stray bullet, and my pets possibly murdered, but she would have been seriously injured in the earthquake. My husband would have probably drowned, trapped in the shower full of 200 pounds of broken tile and glass, with the apartment starting to fill with smoke from the neighbor's kitchen fire. I really don't think that they would have both made it out. And even if my daughter tried to ride her bike to the neighbors, she could have been hit with falling brick from the roof from the aftershocks. I have never told this to them because I think it would scare them both really badly. But this is not the first time the voice in my head has been right. It's just really scary when it is. My friend told me and some other friends to move our stuff off of his gaming table because he was going to do some cleaning in the gaming basement. It looked nearly clean already. The way he said it didn't set well with me. I questioned him on it, but he dismissed it. He even forgot to do the cleaning one week. It turned out the cleaning he was doing was to cover up a crime center from when he murdered someone. He forgot to do it the week before because in his words that I remember, I didn't do cleaning. Someone was supposed to come over but didn't. Turns out, that someone was the person that he was going to murder. I once almost got sold to the cartel. I was 17 and extremely naive. I was new to the area and had no idea that it was a heavy cartel area. I was hanging out with a female cousin of mine who had some sketchy friends that I had no idea were sketchy because I was so naive. We all were smoking some bud, and I started puking uncontrollably. She was okay, so I didn't think much of it until she went to take me home. Her friend walked us down the apartment steps, and then started talking to a group of people. Okay, whatever. Until I had the gut feeling to run for my life. Like, run and never look back. We were only a few blocks from her house. I magically became sober and book it for her house and tell her to as well. I told her I didn't know why, but I had the feeling to run. Fast forward about a month later, her friend straight up told her that he was trying to sell me to them. Not her, just me. I haven't spoken to her since because she remained friends with him. I was 12. I had a corner store 2 streets away from my house. So at 7 p.m., I went to go buy a Mountain Dew. This was Canada in the winter, so it was pitch black. I went and bought it without a problem. The clerk working the cash register actually seemed concerned. He kept asking me if I was okay, so that was probably foreshadowing. I left, and then when I was about to get on the same avenue as my house, I passed by one house, and a guy was taking out his garbage. He looked incredibly French. I'd say he's Napoleon Bonaparte, but 33, and he froze and started staring at me walking by his house. And by now, I had the worst gut feeling about this guy. The way he froze and all terrified me. So I turned the corner to go get on the same avenue as my house. I saw the guy's silhouette standing on the sidewalk. Then I walked further, saw his silhouette on the same avenue. So I called my mom and told her that this guy was suspicious. She said to keep an eye on him. Then I saw him start to walk towards me. I told my mom that he was following me. And then I probably got the world's worst shivers down my spine. All my mom had said was run, so I ran. I felt like I was faster than Usain Bolt. And then after running for about 10 seconds, I turned around, and the guy was gone. He probably realized that I saw him and ran off. Might have thought I was calling the cops. I made it home after running for about an extra 15 seconds, and I burst through the door. And I mean burst. Just panting like all heck, and rushing to lock the door. My family was there, and my stepdad was confused, but my mom told him about the call. I ran upstairs and made sure to enjoy that Mountain Dew while I played video games. I may have risked getting kidnapped for it, after all. One evening, me and my parents were going out to eat for dinner, but had noticed that our gas tank was low after a day of driving around the city. My parents couldn't decide on what to do first, eat or pass by the gas station to refill before heading over. For context, this gas station and Panda Express were a couple of blocks away from each other. I had suddenly gotten really shaken and scared about going to the gas station and asked if we could go eat. I expressed that I was hungry, but also that I had the weirdest feeling in the pit of my stomach telling me not to go. They agreed to eat first, and after dinner, we had found out that a stabbing took place around the same time that we would have arrived if we had went to the gas station instead. I work at a small credit union, and we have limits for how much we keep in our drawers up front. Anything over the limit needs to be put in the vault. We also have a limit for how much we can have in our drawer at the end of the day. Excess gets sold to the vault. One day, a teller left early for the day and sold me her excess cash because the vault teller wasn't available. It was around $7,000, and I'm putting it in my drawer so I can post the adjustment for her selling the cash to me when I see this man walk in, and something feels off. Gut feeling tells me that something bad is going to happen. I greet the man, and he walks up to my window and then stops, puts a finger like "just a moment please," and walks back out of the door. I look at the other teller on the line with me, and we both thought that it was weird. I decide not to wait and put my excess cash in the vault. I walked to the back and was counting the cash that I was putting away when I hear this clattering noise from the teller line, and I go back out and see the man walking out of the billing, and I ask the teller if he's okay, and he tells me that the man had just robbed him. The man passed him a note telling him to give him all the cash that he had. The clattering noise was the teller pushing his rolled coin through the window. If he had come to my window, he would have gotten over $7,000. But because he left and I had that gut feeling, he robbed the other teller and only ended up with around $300. To this day, I feel terrible for leaving that teller alone. I didn't do anything against policy by stepping away, but knowing that he had to handle that alone caused me a lot of feelings of guilt. Mine was a couple of years ago, on the way back home from a school trip to the water skiing lake, about a half an hour from our school. Me and my friends were about 18 years old at the time, and had to drive to the lake on our own. There was no bus or anything organized by our school, so me and a few friends drove together in a car. I was not the driver at the time. On our journey back to the school, an ambulance crossed our way and drove past us in the direction that we were coming from. This was not too uncommon, because this was on the main route from our local hospital to the next bigger hospital in the next city. This situation in general was not special at all. Me and my friends joked a bit about the ambulance driver, who looked kinda bored while driving with flashing blue lights. He probably has no patient in the back. He just wants to get home quick. That's why his blue lights and siren were on, we joked. A few seconds behind him was an emergency doctor's car following the ambulance, which sometimes happens in Germany, but isn't too common. I don't know why, but in this moment, I just thought that my dad was in the ambulance and that he had a bad car accident. I really don't know why this thought crossed my mind, but there was no reason to think that, especially with the specific thought that it might be my dad. I just had that gut feeling, which I really didn't like. A few minutes later, when we arrived to the next small village where my cell phone had reception again, I saw that I had a missed call from my mom. I rarely get calls from my mom, so my feeling about my dad being in the ambulance just a few minutes prior intensified. Because I was still in the car with my friends, I decided to wait until I was back at the school and out of the car to call her back. When I called her back, my gut feeling was mostly right. My mother called because there was something wrong with my dad. That he was on the way to the hospital in the bigger city, and that he mostly was fine. I shouldn't worry. She told me that I should go to my grandparents so that they can drive me to the local hospital, so that I can drive my dad's car back home. I didn't worry too much because she sounded calm and said that he was fine. She told me that in the evening I should come to the hospital in the next city and take her home. At my grandparents', I learned that my dad had had a heart attack and had to be rushed to the hospital in the next city. Luckily, he survived the heart attack with no major consequential damage, but that was a shock. In the following days, I found out that the ambulance crossing our way that day was indeed transporting my dad, who was fighting for his life in that ambulance. He's still alive and well today, after having 2 more heart attacks since then. But every now and then I have to think about that day, and to this day, I still don't know why this thought about him being in there crossed my mind. It still gives me goosebumps. Me and my best friend were hanging out at my rural ranch. No cars in the driveway. I'm 21 and he's 18. He's outside the back of the house pretending he's a blacksmith with our crappy homemade charcoal furnace, when a truck rolls up into our driveway. At that moment, I knew that something was very wrong just from the sound of the vehicle. We got so few visitors that I can identify who is approaching by the sound of their car. It's 3 dudes in a quad cab truck. My buddy approaches the truck, blacksmith hammer in hand. An important fact about my buddy is that he looks like he's 13 years old. At this point, I grab my rifle. Who the heck are they? The driver gets out, and he has a semi-automatic in his holster on his hip. I sight in on him between the curtains and window shutters. They claim to be local ranchers selling their meat door to door. If they were local ranchers, they'd know that you don't just ignore a no trespassing sign like the one on our gate. They ask my buddy if his parents are home, to which my buddy, thinking quickly, said yes, his father is home, and his uncle might want some fresh steaks. He pulled out his phone and called the cops, to which the men quickly got in the truck and left. I knew none of this. I was just watching the body language of the situation going down through the sights of a rifle, ready for them to try something. I'm pretty sure that they were there to rob us. Thank you so much for listening to all of the stories in this video. I hope you enjoyed them. I also hope that you enjoy the extra rain at the end. Get a good night's sleep, everyone, and I'll read to you in the next video. Bye-bye now.